Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Per Kassel. I'm an associate professor of history here at the University of Michigan, and also a member of the Center for Japanese Studies. I believe I'm the newest member, I guess, the newest edition. So this is part of what we do, putting in front of crowds and speaking. So there's no CGS lecture next week, but in 2 weeks we have a special lecture by Brad Hammond, which is co-sponsored by the Bentley Historical Library. It's titled Remembering the University of Michigan's Wartime American Workers. This lecture is being held on February the 19th, the day of remembrance for Japanese American incarceration during World War II. Please join us in observing this important day. This talk will be on the 10th floor in Weiser Hall and live streamed on Zoom. We also have a free film screening tonight. Join us for the cult classic film Tampopo. It's an eccentric ramen Western adventure intertwined with vignettes about love, life, and food. The film starts at 7 p.m. at the State Theater. Doors open at 6:30. Admission is free for everyone. No registration is required, and seating is first come, first serve. To learn more about all upcoming CJS events, please visit our website or social media pages. For attendees on Zoom, webcams and microphones have been turned off. Please use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit questions, and our presenter will address as many as possible in their talk. If you would like closed caption, live transcription is available. The caption settings are at the bottom right corner of Zoom. And this brings us to the introduction of today's speaker, Matt Fraleigh, Professor Matt Fraleigh from Brandeis University, who is our Toyota Visiting Professor 2025-2026. Now, it's a daunting task to present Professor Fraleigh, because when he gave his last talk, the person who invited him, the faculty who invited him, Professor Mike Auerbach, gave a very exhaustive kind of caption of his career and summarizing his manifold achievements. So there's no way I can best that, so you just have to go on YouTube and watch that if you want to get the full story. So Matt Fraleigh and I, we know each other from graduate school at Harvard. Always been a great fan of his research into Kanbun, or Japanese Sinitic, which is a very small field in Japanese studies. I think there's only Professor Fraleigh and Professor Rob Tuck, I think. They're the two only people that pops to mind here in the United North America who's doing it on a full-time basis. And as you will learn in this talk, we maybe should pay more attention to Kanbun. Now, Professor Fraleigh has published 2 books focused on the 19th century sinological scholar, poet, and journalist Narushima Ryuhoku, a study entitled Plucking Chrysanthemums, Narushima Ryuhoku and Sinitic Literary Traditions in Modern Japan, published at Harvard University Press 2016, as well as an annotated translation, No Chronicles of Yanagibashi, a diary of a journey to the West, Narushima Ryuhoku Reports from Home and Abroad, published at Cornell University Press in 2010. He's also co-edited a volume with historian Joshua Fogel, who requires no sort of further introduction in this crowd. We all owe Joshua Fogel a lot of favors, and he's a big promoter in the field. Now, together they have published a volume called Sino-Japanese Reflections, Literary and Cultural Interactions Between China and Japan in Early Modernity, published by the Gruyter 2022. And then, of course, we have numerous translation articles and other distinctions that Professor Auerbach went through last time we introduced Professor Fraleigh. This time, Professor Fraleigh will introduce us to conceptions of sound and language in Japanese Sinitic poetry. Can we please give him a warm welcome as he enters the stage?
Thank you, Per, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank my hosts here at the University of Michigan. It has been a wonderful experience to join your faculty this year. So let me, title of my talk, Distant Listening, Conceptions of Sound and Language in Japanese Sinitic Poetry. I think it is fair to say that sound is fundamental to most definitions of poetry. Many literary commentators have located poetry's distinctiveness in the combined importance it places upon both sound and sense. In his introductory text, Poetry, the Basics, for example, British poet and translator Geoffrey Wainwright begins by observing how quickly and immediately young learners can derive pleasure from the rhyme and rhythm of poetic language. Pointing out what he sees as the crucial role that sound, timing, and rhythm play in the making of poetry, Wainwright concludes, "Poetry works on the ear. It is a form developed for and in performance within a long oral tradition." Or in his widely used literary theory, A Very Short Introduction, the American literary scholar Jonathan Culler writes, "Literature is language that foregrounds language itself. In particular, poetry organizes the sound plane of language so as to make it something to reckon with." More than 60 years ago, Roman Jakobson wrote, "Poetry is not the only area where sound symbolism makes itself felt, but it is a province where the internal nexus between sound and meaning changes from latent into patent and manifests itself most palpably and intensely." Yet, as the editors of this recent collection on the topic acknowledge in their introduction, literary theorists have been both certain about the central importance of sound to poetry and unable to exactly specify the nature of that importance. Needless to say, the intimate connection between sound and sense in poetry is not a recent or a specifically Western notion. We see it articulated several millennia ago in the great preface to the Classic of Poetry, the foundational expression of literary theory in East Asia, which sees poetry as the way inner intentions move into the world, taking the form of words, patterned sound. But what about poetry written in a language by those who do not speak it? How should we understand the oral dimensions of such poetic traditions if they were not exactly heard in the conventional sense by their composers? Like their counterparts elsewhere in the sinographic world, by which I mean China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, what are those areas today, composers of Sinitic, that is classical Chinese, poetry in early modern Japan were keenly attentive to prosodic rules, tonality, rhyme, and other features that are conventionally associated with aurality. So this is a poem by Sugawara no Michizane, and it goes, 米家三十月，落泪百千行，万事皆入蒙，世事养比苍. Since leaving home 3 or 4 months, I shed tears 100 or 1,000 lines. Myriad affairs, all like a dream. Time and again, I look up at the blue heavens. So just to comment briefly on the formal features, this is a pentasyllabic quatrain, and you can see in the red are indications of where there is end rhyme. So at the end of the second line and the end of the fourth line, the even lines, you can see that those sounds rhyme. So in modern Mandarin, we have hung and sang. Japanese, Sinitic or Sino-Japanese reading, it would be ko and so. And also, there is something called tonal prosody, which you can see in, it's basically the alternation of different sorts of sounds. As you probably know, there are 4 tones in Chinese, and the alternation of so-called level and deflected tones is basically the alternation between sounds where the pitch does not change, level tones, and sounds where it does change. So in the diagram, the empty circle, you can see here, that indicates a level tone, and the filled-in circle indicates a deflected tone. And there was a rule that assured variation in the distribution of these tones, such that the second character and the fourth character should be opposite within a single line, and then in between the first line of the couplet and the second line of the couplet, it should switch. So here you have a level tone, and then it's deflected. Here you have a deflected tone, and then it's level in the next line. There was also a rule that said in between the end line of one couplet and the beginning line of another couplet that you should have the same pattern repeat in the second and fourth characters. You can see this is deflected, deflected, level, level, and then with the same principle applies again, we reverse the second and the fourth in between the first and second lines of that couplet. This is the sort of the most basic rule, and there are many other rules that govern the prosodic features, but that kind of gives you a sense, I think, of some of the kinds of concerns that were in the minds of those who were writing Sinitic poetry. Clearly, Michizane was carefully attentive to rhyme and prosody when he composed this poem, yet such aspects of the Sinitic poem were usually inaudible in the form of oral performance that came to be dominant in Japan from the mid-10th century onward, interpretive recitation aloud by kundoku, or vernacular reading. And kanbun kundoku is a process that transforms the Sinitic text into a sort of a translationese, a form of the sinified register of Japanese. Peter Kornitsky has used the expression bound translation to talk about this phenomenon, meaning that the result is very closely tied, very strictly bound to the original text. But what is involved is syntactic rearrangement, moving from the verb order sequence of the Sinitic to putting the verb at the end, as in Japanese, making additional changes to lexicon, and also adding the connective tissue to make the text intelligible in Japanese. So to give an example, the first couplet of the Michizane poem I introduced a minute ago might be read according to this procedure. Ie o hanarete mitsuki yotsuki otsuru namuda wa momotsura chitsura. That's a rendering offered by the eminent scholar Kawaguchi Hisao. He's a present-day scholar. Another scholar offers a completely different version, Rika Sanshigetsu Rakurui Hyakusenko, and so on. So there's a great deal of a variety in possible approaches to kundoku. Today I'd like to look at how Japanese theorists and practitioners of Sinitic poetry came to terms with the central issue of sound in their writing. How to achieve euphony in poems written in a language that they did not speak. But even more fundamentally, we must ask, how did early modern Japanese poets conceive of the linguistic status of Sinitic texts? To be sure, the particular rhythms of Japanese kundoku recitation could themselves be the focus of creative attention on the part of poets and appreciation on the part of listeners. But as we shall see, the specifics of Japanese recitational practice were not the main concern of contemporary commentators on the sound of Sinitic poetry. Almost without exception, they were interested principally in questions that confronted all poets in the sinographic world. In other words, these Japanese commentators discussed tonal prosody, rhyme, and other features of Sinitic texts in ways that engaged continental commentators, even though their own conclusions might diverge from them. This research is part of a larger project I've been working on recently that seeks to examine the ways in which Sinitic poetic composition was conceptualized and discussed by Japanese authors from the early modern to the modern period. In this project, I'm interested in very basic but somewhat elusive questions. To put it most simply, what did Japanese practitioners of this time period think they were doing in writing Sinitic verse? How did they understand their project in relation to Japan's vernacular literary traditions? How did they situate Japan's Sinitic poetry with respect to Chinese forms and precedents? And what, if anything, did they identify as specific to Japanese Sinitic poetry? One of the main sources that I have been examining in the hope of addressing these sorts of questions is a large body of mainly early modern Japanese poetic treatises known as shiwa, remarks on poetry or poetry talks. At the risk of stating the obvious, what shi means here is not poetry in general, which is what it means in Japanese today, but traditional Sinitic poetry specifically. So the genre of Shiwa flourished throughout East Asia, where the same Sinitic compound, which you see here, was pronounced as Shiwa or Shihua or Xihua. Typically written by a single author, these texts often quote specific works of Sinitic poetry and offer commentary, lore, backstories, thus combining features of an anthology and a poetic treatise. The genre had its origins in China, where the term Shihua first came to be used in the Song. Most scholars identify Ouyang Xiu's late 11th century Liuyi Shihua as the founding exemplar of the genre. It is the first text to have the word Shihua in its title. As we can see from this prefatory comment on the text, Ouyang Xiu wrote it after he went into retirement to provide fodder for relaxed conversations about poetry. His work consists of short remarks on specific poems and poets woven together in a casual, following the brush style. Though the precise number of sections depends on the edition, the text of Liuyi Shihua gathers about 29 short units. And some scholars have argued that you can see the influence of this structure on some of the other texts in this form that appeared in East Asia. So 200 years later, the late Kamakura era Zen priest Kokan Shiden wrote Saihoku Shiwa. This is the first Shiwa by a Japanese author. And in addition to choosing the word Shiwa in his title, Kokan Shiden linked his text to Ouyang Xiu's Liuyi Shihua by making his own text consist of 29 units too. Similarly, Ikyubo's Pagan Sosol likewise comprises 29 units. Depending on the edition, there's some dispute about whether it's 29 or 30, and some scholars would suggest that, you know, it's really more 30, but the counting has been sort of arranged to make the conformity there. In any case, no one would question that Ouyang Xiu's Liuyi Shihua was a powerful influence throughout East Asia. So Kokan Shiden's early example notwithstanding, the Shiwa genre actually came to flourish in Japan many centuries later, during the mid to late Edo period, when Chinese exemplars such as Yenyu's Zanglang Shihua were reprinted, and Japanese Sinitic poets began to publish their own treatises in increasing numbers. More than 60 Japanese Shiwa from this period are widely known and easily accessible today. They've been gathered together into this 10-volume set, Nihon Shiwa Sousho. This is a list of the 61 titles in Nihon Shiwa Sousho. And in some ways, it sounds tautological, but a text is a Shiwa by virtue of being included in this series. In this slide, I've just indicated in orange the titles that have the word Shiwa in their titles. You can see it's perhaps only 1/3 of the total. So it's not necessary to have the title use the term Shiwa in order to be considered part of this category. But that's true not just in Japan, but elsewhere in China and Korea as well. Indeed, throughout the Sinosphere, it's true that it's common to kind of grandfather in earlier titles. So even texts that appeared prior to Ouyang Xiu's Liuyi Shihua can retrospectively be included in the category. That's true in Japan as well. You can see Kukai's Bunkyo Hifuron is on this list, even though it's from many centuries earlier. So in any case, in Japan, as elsewhere in East Asia, the category Shiwa designates a heterogeneous mix. Some works abound in interesting anecdotes. Some focus instead on issues of diction. Some are written in a casual and desultory style, while others are more formal theoretical treatments. Japanese Shiwa authors wrote their texts in both Wabun and Kanbun, and Japanese Shiwa are arguably more heterogeneous than elsewhere in East Asia, probably because of the greater size and diversity of readership. in his brief outline of Japanese Shiwa, Fujikawa Hideo identifies 5 categories of Shiwa. Introductory works that address practical questions about the craft of Sinitic versification, tendentious works that argue for a particular vision of Sinitic poetic expression, works of annotation that explicate difficult phrases in Sinitic poetry, works that trace the history of Japanese Sinitic verse, and works that gather Sinitic verse from China and Japan and provide commentary upon it. Though they have received very little attention in Anglophone scholarship, several of these Shiwa were widely read and influential works in their time. Some of them were even at the very cutting edge of academic and cultural endeavor. One of the best known, for example, is Kikuchi Gozan's Gozando Shiwa, which appeared in 15 volumes between 1807 and 1832. It exemplifies the 5th category in Fujikawa's typology, the combination anthology commentary. In his book-length study of Gozando Shiwa, Ibi Takashi sees this serially published text as nothing less than Japan's earliest commercial periodical. He argues that inasmuch as it targeted a non-specific plurality of readers, was published at semi-regular intervals, contained contemporaneous information and criticism, and provided its editor with his main source of livelihood, Gozando Shiwa can reasonably be considered the first example of Japanese commercial journalism. Another innovative text, the exemplar of Fujikawa Hideo's 4th category of Japanese Shiwa, is Emura Hokkai's Nihon Shishi. Published in 1770, this 5-volume work is not only the first history of Sinitic poetry in Japan, but also, in Otani Masao's estimation, the first full-fledged literary history to be published in Japan. Or perhaps it can lay claim to an even greater title. The Chinese scholar Cai Zhenchu has similarly praised Emura Hokkai's Nihon Shishi as a forerunner in the genre of literary history, pointing out its appearance 100 years prior to the first Western history of Chinese literature by Vasily Vasilyev. In addition to identifying exemplary modes of Sinitic verse, the authors of these various types of Shiwa devoted substantial attention to reflecting upon the nature of Sinitic poetic expression, its aims, and sometimes the particular challenges that Japanese poets faced. I said a few moments ago that one of the issues that Japanese Shiwa authors addressed was the question of how best to create euphonic poetry written in a language that they didn't speak. But how did they conceive of this language of literary Sinitic? Did they imagine themselves to be writing in some variety of Japanese, or did they instead conceive of literary Sinitic as fundamentally a foreign language? Obviously, if we are going to discuss the extent to which, or the ways in which literary Sinitic was regarded as foreign, we must be careful to specify what we mean by foreign. I agree that many pre-modern and modern producers of sinographic texts in Japan did not regard such materials as foreign in the sense of irrelevant, alien, or unfamiliar. Clearly, sinographic texts were central to the learning and creative enterprise of many Japanese over the centuries. There's no doubt that Sinitic texts are an indispensable and vital part of the Japanese literary tradition. I don't think anyone working in the field today would seriously dispute that. Yet it is problematic to imagine that traditionally educated Japanese readers lacked a fundamental awareness of literary Sinitic texts as being written in a foreign language. That is, a language originating outside of Japan that was governed by a syntax and grammar completely distinct from those of the local language and with an evolving lexicon intimately tied to its Chinese sources. A keen consciousness of the alterity of the Chinese language was a shared point of departure for the writers of remarks on poetry in early modern Japan. Take the example of Gion Nankai, an accomplished poet who wrote 2 introductory Shiwa from Fujikawa's first type. In Shiketsu, his popular treatise for aspiring Sinitic poets, he states matter-of-factly that Sinitic poetry is written in the words and script of China. The third category of Shiwa in Fujikawa's typology are remarks on poetry that explicate obscure or otherwise noteworthy poetic diction. Perhaps the best known is Katsugen Shiwa, published in 1787 by the Tendai Buddhist priest Rikunyo, which provides the author's consideration of Sinitic vocabulary in over 800 entries, like a browser's dictionary or a readable lexicon. The preface to the volume, written by Rikunyo's poetic associate Daiten, indicates the linguistic consciousness that animates the text, revealing an unmistakable conception of Sinitic as a foreign language. Daiten writes, Daiten writes, investigating and elucidating the meanings of words constitutes the beginning of study. How much more is this true in the case of a Japanese who studies Chinese? It is simply impossible to read Rikunyo's wide-ranging remarks in this text without concluding that he fundamentally conceives of Sinitic poetry as something written in a foreign language, one that he had devoted his life to studying. We can also glimpse such language consciousness in the efforts of Sinitic poets in Japan to find appropriate terms to represent specific domestic sites and historical events, unique local customs, as well as distinctive flora and fauna. Yamada Suyu's Suyuken Shiwa is a late Edo text that is heavily indebted to Rikunyo's Katsugen Shiwa. The very first matter Suyu takes up in his treatise is the proper Sinitic term for the kajika, a small frog with a truly delightful call. Hopefully this will work. Get the idea. So Suyu notes that the frog has long been celebrated by Waka poets, but laments that Japan's Sinitic poets have not written about the frog and its enchanting call because the proper Sinitic term is not widely known. Again, the issue is not the existence of sinographs corresponding to kajika. There was an accepted sinographic orthography for kajika within Japan, but rather ignorance about what sinographs might indicate the frog to sinospheric poets outside Japan. The widespread attentiveness to this issue on the part of Sinitic poets in early modern Japan tells us something about how they conceived their audience. While the chance to exchange poems with intellectuals from elsewhere in the sinosphere was a possibility available to travelers to Nagasaki, where a large population of Qing merchants resided, or to the lucky few chosen to meet emissaries from Choson, Korea, for many Sinitic poets, such international exchanges would only be theoretical. Nevertheless, many were attentive to an imagined sinospheric reader. The presence of Chinese merchants in Nagasaki helped to foster, in the early 18th century, a boom in interest in learning spoken Chinese among Japanese intellectuals. Scholars such as Ogyu Sorai encouraged the study of contemporary Chinese pronunciation as a means of approaching the Sinitic classics and were sharply critical of Japan's traditional sinological approaches mediated by the kundoku method of vernacular reading. Yet, as critics of this approach were quick to point out, linguistic changes on the continent over the centuries meant that the language spoken by Chinese visitors to Japan in the 18th century was quite different from that of the Tang Dynasty, let alone of more remote antiquity. Whether or not they supported Sorai's methods, the scholars who wrote in his wake could not ignore his intervention. Let us consider how two scholars from a subsequent generation wrestled with the issue of how knowledge of contemporary spoken Chinese might be incorporated into the study of Sinitic poetry. In mid-18th century Kyushu, the scholar Miura Baien was hard at work on a primer called Shitetsu. I've translated it here as poetry tracks. The more literal translation would probably be poetry ruts, but that doesn't sound very nice in English. It has kind of very negative or distracting connotations in English. But the association with rut that you should imagine here is kind of the image of universality, standardization, precedent, those kinds of positive images here. Getting on track, that's why I chose track. It seems that Miura completed the work around 1774, correcting the text and supplementing it with several prefaces and afterwards in the early 1780s before it was published in 1786. It's a wide-ranging treatise, and Baien discusses issues of sound and language at several points in it. Ogyū Sorai had famously compared reading Sinitic texts through kundoku as scratching an itch through one's boot. And here, Baien suggests a similar metaphor for the gap between Japanese readings of sinographs and their Chinese phonetic counterparts. He writes, "Though writing came to us from China, the so-called Goon and Kanon, Sino-Japanese pronunciations of sinographs, do not represent the true sound shapes of China. It is therefore like gazing at something, though separated by a wall. It is common to mistake the meaning of graphs or the structure of sentences. If one wishes to understand, one must study and pay particular attention to phonetics. Let me first make an analogy with our language. If one says minume no ura, minume be, the sound is connected to minu, to not see. Or if one says iwate no yama, iwate mountain, the sound is connected to iwade, to not speak. Without being familiar with the Japanese language, how could one understand the meaning?" So having illustrated the suggestive polysemy of toponyms from Japan's first collection of vernacular poetry, the Manyoshu, Baien goes on to offer examples of a Tang poem that hinges on similar wordplay, directing his students' attention to the necessity of grasping such potential double meanings lying behind the sinographs. Baien goes on to draw directly on some of the materials produced recently to aid Japanese students of spoken Chinese, such as an edition of a Tang poetry anthology glossed with pronunciations in contemporary Mandarin. So in this instance, he provides the first two couplets of an octave by the Tang poet Su Ting. And you can see at the side of the characters here an imitation of contemporaneous Chinese pronunciation. So it says Tong Won, Wan maybe, Wan, Chun Chun, and then this is Ko Len. So Baien calls attention here to the extraordinarily concentrated use of nasalized sounds, noting that only 6 of the 28 words in this poem does not take part in this consonance. So you can see all of the poem's words, almost all of them, end in either an n sound or an ng sound, but except the ones that are in red there. Aside from those, they're all share this feature. And so he wants to call the attention of his students to this sonic feature. Baien was also aware, however, of the critiques of Sorai's approach and the objections that had been leveled against those of his school. And in this passage, he presents his students with the differing opinions. He says, "Needless to say, unless one is familiar with Western, that is Chinese pronunciation, it is difficult to be familiar with the linguistic shape used over there. However, even for those Japanese scholars who claim to be familiar with their language, when one looks at their Sinitic poetry and prose, one also finds inversions and violations. It seems that it is difficult to obtain the sense that one would have being born in China and being brought up in the Chinese language. However, just as the saying goes that take a single bolt of brocade, even if the reverse side looks different, it is still the same thing. If one chants a Sinitic poem in Japanese and finds the melody pleasing, it will also be good in the Western Chinese pronunciation. If reading in Japanese leaves sounds caught in the throat and ties the tongue, it will be the same in the Western pronunciation." So Baien draws here upon a phrase that occurs in Sorai's Rules for Students. In the original context, Sorai had an imagined someone propose this analogy of the reversible piece of brocade only so that he could thoroughly reject it and insist that his students encounter Sinitic texts in their foreignness and without subjecting them to domesticating strategies. Yet Bayan instead adopts the position of Sorai's imagined interlocutor and suggests that even if one reads through kundoku, the resulting perception won't be too egregiously off. Whereas Bayan aimed to provide his students with an even-handed introduction to the debate, his contemporary Nakai Chikuzan weighed in more definitively on one side in his mammoth treatise focused on sound and Sinitic poetry, Shiritsucho, published in 1776. He wrote, "Recently a few scholars discussing poetry have said that one must make learning contemporary Chinese pronunciation central. They argue that since poetry originated in chanting, one fluent in Chinese pronunciation would be able to know whether something accords with the rules or not. The poems of the ancients were sung aloud and naturally attained harmony. If one is ignorant of the Chinese pronunciation, then the poems he makes will be full of washu, so-called Japanese practices. And if he showed them to a Chinese person, he could not escape being secretly laughed at. People have busied themselves with this matter, thinking that it is a way to apprehend the poetic rules of Tang and Ming. Alas, being fond of seeking the unusual and proclaiming novelty is a common human sentiment. How much more so for a theory that seems plausible and close to the truth. No wonder that people of the world have rushed toward this approach. From my perspective, however, the set rules of poems in the recent style are preserved in books. If you want to rid yourself of Japanese practices, then simply study those books. But to put them aside and go seeking instead in a remote tongue, chasing after shadows in a side path is a lesser concern, and making spoken Chinese central is debatable." As Chikuzan suggests here, his principal methodology was to pay close attention to the primary texts themselves. The bulk of his treatise consists of his painstaking analysis of the prosody of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of mainly Tang poems, with some Song and Ming examples also. From this tremendous store of empirical data, he discerns several prosodic patterns that had not been fully articulated in poetic treatises thus far. Indeed, the present-day scholar Liu Xinjia has praised his findings and shown that Chikuzan's treatise was the principal source for a work of Chinese scholarship on Tang poetic prosody published in the early 20th century. Chikuzan dismisses the relevance of Qing-era Chinese pronunciation to questions of Tang-era tonal prosody in this vivid passage. As for those who now dwell in the capital or in the eastern provinces, who have never met a Chinese person, and yet who proudly take delight in their mastery of Chinese pronunciation, I know they are just peering at a leopard through a reed pipe. When they discourse on the sound of poetry, they say that there is no proper poem that cannot be sung, but whether the prosody fits or not cannot be determined on this basis. A line such as rising to heaven, descending from heaven, a single crane, has 3 entering tones at the end, and yet a Qing visitor would sing this no different from any other poem. Truly, the tones of antiquity cannot be verified anymore. One can only fit the sound to the poem. One does not measure the poem based upon the sound. The poem is just the poem. What need is there to be concerned about the Chinese pronunciation? How true that is. And so the line that he gives, the example here, in modern Mandarin pronunciation, you would read this, 上天, 下天, 鹤一只. However, as Chikuzan points out here, the last 3 characters all are the entering tone, which is still present in the Sino-Japanese readings of those characters. You would read those characters kaku, itsu, and seki. So that the p to k sounds at the end are still audible in Sino-Japanese, but they're gone in Mandarin. These debates would continue to roil Japanese Sinitic poetry circles in coming years. I'd like to turn now to 2 shiwa that focus specifically on the issue of sound of Sinitic verse from a few decades later. The first is Shiritsu by Akazawa Ichido. Shiritsu may be translated as the rules or maybe the law for Sinitic poetry, and was published in 1833 while the author was still alive. He was a scholar originally from Sanuki who spent much of his life living in Kyoto. In Shiritsu, he writes, Sinitic poetry takes sound as its principal consideration. A work lacking harmonious sound fails to become a poem. The language of the Chinese people makes regular use of rhyme and distinguishes light and heavy sounds. For this reason, their poems, while there are of course differences in terms of quality, can sound harmonious and be worth recitation. Those who aspire to write Sinitic poems must put themselves in the place of those people and learn from specific dynasties. So Ichido's insistence on the importance of sound in thinking about Sinitic poetry is clear from the contents of Shiritsu. You see here, it includes several discussions of topics focused on poetry's aural dimensions. The sections on tone, rhyme, and parallelism are a major portion of the text, and a principal focus of the section on methods involves concerns of sound. He writes, those ignorant of sound who recklessly cobble together words produce works that are diffuse one moment and compressed the next, leisurely and then suddenly rushed. In the throat, they lack consistency of articulation and are, of course, not fit for oral recitation. Ichido's answer to the question of what a Japanese composer of Sinitic poetry should do is that rather than reading Shiwa and other abstract treatises on what makes great poetry, the best thing is simply to read and reflect upon the great poems themselves, echoing the primary text-centered approach of Bayan that we saw earlier. So this slide is probably too small, but my point was just the intricacy of the taxonomies that he develops here based upon his encounters with primary texts. The contents show his focus on rhyme, structure, and rhythm. He identifies several faults of poetry, which he ultimately says you can mostly ignore. He shows a kind of a mode of approaching works of Sinitic poetry by thinking about oral matters. 50 years after Chikuzan, the response of a Qing reader to a Japanese to poetry by Japanese Sinitic poets figures in Ichido's discussion, though he draws a different conclusion. He writes, when Nagasaki Chinese read the poems of those who are esteemed as great Sinitic poets in our land, they inevitably dismiss them and don't approve of their works. The reason is because these poets don't know about sound. Whereas Akazawa Ichido seems ready to defer to the opinion of contemporary Chinese in questions of sound, a very different response to the relevance of knowledge of contemporary spoken Chinese is seen in the final sound-focused Shiwa I would like to discuss, Ono Senzo's Shayu Shiritsuron, Debates on Tonal Prosody Among Friends. This text is essentially a collection of letters originating with a query that Ono Senzo sent to Rai Sanyo, his teacher in Sinitic poetry. Sanyo responded to his student's question, but also solicited responses from several of his associates, lest he leave anything out. The initial letter from Ono Senzo, the reply from Rai Sanyo, the answers that Rai Sanyo received from 4 other scholars and poets, and Sanyo's thoughts in response to these are all included in the text, along with a brief note from Sanyo's uncle, Kyohei. So the letter from Ono begins with a simple question about tonal prosody. Ono notes that he has often asked his teacher to correct his poems, relying on Sanyo to identify mistakes in the tonal prosody patterns. But recently he's begun to wonder how to reconcile the necessity of obeying tonal prosody rules with what he knows about these rules' origins. It is generally agreed that the rules of tonal prosody developed at a time when poems were still sung to musical accompaniment. In the early Tang, poets such as Shen Quanqi and Song Zhiwan developed the alternating patterns of tonal prosody to create euphony and facilitate musical accompaniment. But now, he writes, the way of reciting poetry and song has already been abandoned, even in China, as you, Master, once pointed out to me. And yet, even today, people fastidiously observe these rules. I don't understand why this should be so. After all, it is because of the food in his cauldron that a cook labors to make a harmonious blend of the 5 flavors. But now that the way of reciting poetry and song has been abandoned, to preserve the rules of tonal prosody is like worrying about the 5 flavors when there's no food in the cauldron. This doubt leads Ono to wonder if some other set of rules, beyond those consolidated as poems in the recent style, might also prove euphonious. In response, Dai Sanyo, recently returned from travels to Western Japan, argues against mastering contemporary Chinese pronunciation. He describes his encounter with Chinese merchants in Nagasaki and with interpreters of spoken Chinese, about whom he has a decidedly low opinion. He says, "I think that studying Chinese pronunciation is not worth the effort, and that the 8 faults are not worth worrying about. The reason is that the practice of recitation and song has disappeared over there, in China. Arguing vehemently about the importance of spoken Chinese is a tool that the interpreters use to lord over others. In regard to the query in your letter, I think that even if one discards mastering contemporary Chinese pronunciation and the 8 faults, when it comes to aligning level and deflected tones, one has no choice but to follow the old rules." In other words, compared to Ichido, Sanyo has a strikingly different view about the relevance of contemporary Chinese pronunciation to questions about Sinitic poetic practice. He forcefully rejects the recent fashionability of spoken Chinese study. And yet this does not mean Sanyo had any doubts about the fundamental foreignness of Sinitic or the importance of classical Chinese precedents. Just as Nakai Chikuzan had, Sanyo goes on to elaborate an argument about diachronic linguistic change that ties particular forms that are dominant at any moment to changes in the temper of the times. Yet equally critical to Sanyo's argument is his observation that amid such obvious changes, some things endure, that certain patterns prevail not as the result of human intervention or artifice, but as the almost inevitable result of natural processes. He says, "Language shifts in accord with the times, and pronunciation and tone also change accordingly. But there are also therein things that do not undergo such changes. They emerge from natural momentum." He goes on to trace the shifts of verse forms from tetrasyllabic poems in the Shijing to the Chuzi, the emergence of pentasyllabic and heptasyllabic verse forms, and the eventual development of poems in the recent style. But he argues that these changes were not so much the result of individual human agency, but came about because of natural forces. He points out continuities between the pentasyllabic and heptasyllabic forms that would become the poetic mainstream and instances of pentasyllabic and heptasyllabic lines in earlier texts. Whereas the formation of tonal prosody rules might seem to be due to the intervention of specific individuals, in fact, he argues that these rules arose from natural necessities and principles. Citing earlier poetic lines that adhered to the rules that would later become formalized, Sanyo argues for understanding the eventually codified rules of tonal prosody as almost inevitable. He also says that no matter what your ability is, even the great eminent poets of later years in China, they all bowed their heads and followed the guidelines of Xiuwen, that is Shan Yue, and Shan Chunchui and Song Zhiwen. Even these several masters inevitably revere and adhere to these rules, which shows us that this is something that cannot be changed through the force of individual talent. Even among Chinese people, this is the case, to say nothing of the situation here, where we use their language to express our feelings. Now, if one, for the moment, discards one's ears and uses his eyes to read through the collection of Tang and Song, Ming and Qing, following the lines, then one can conjecture about the enduring, unchanging laws. In highlighting how later Chinese poets maintained the fundamental rules and conventions about tonal prosody and rhyme established in earlier eras, rather than reinventing them in accord with their own times, Sanyo prepares the ground for an analogy that likens their situation to that of Japanese of his own time. Rather than emphasizing divergences in spatial distance, his focus is on shared temporal distance. The remaining letters in this Shiwa offer a variety of views on the question of how to conceptualize sound and Sinitic poetry, but they agree on observing certain fundamental rules of tonal prosody codified in the Tang, even as they critique later Chinese interpretations of them. For example, Umetsuji Shunsho, he makes a fascinating analogy here to seek to use the voices and mouths of our country's people to master the songs of the Chinese is, to use a metaphor, like shooting an arrow from a distance of 100 paces. While the arrow that he fired belongs to the archer, the target that receives the arrow belongs to the other side, that is China. So Shunsho continues to expand upon this metaphor, emphasizing how just as the archer can improve his odds of hitting the target through training, so too can the Japanese poet be more successful in his literary composition through a circumspect approach, preparing through reading and practice. And yet there are limitations. Once all that has been done, as for whether the poem I create is perfectly proper in terms of the four tones, the manner of articulation, the clarity of voice, and so on, or if instead it is all mistaken, whether it turns out to be an elegant work or a vulgar folk ditty, I cannot tell by singing it out loud. Those who can tell by singing it out loud are thousands of miles away in China. And since I am writing this here and now, I cannot venture thousands of miles away to go ask them. Even as Shunsho stresses the importance of the poet's diligent preparations as he familiarized himself with prosodic rules and internalized exemplary verses, he concedes that ultimately the sonic effects of the poem he labored to create would not be immediately discernible to him. While he could make a poem, the singing of it was not something he could directly judge. Nevertheless, he consoled himself with an argument that resonates with Sanyo's assertion that the roles of tonal prosody were ultimately grounded in natural principles. He says, I cannot know whether its tonal prosody is harmonious or disharmonious and make corrections accordingly. And so if I want to correct it, I must decide myself. I can only be content with that. Level and deflected tones are like inhalation and exhalation. They are the breathing of the cosmos, the flow of yin and yang. Though our country's people are separated from the Chinese by thousands of miles, we are people living in this world. We are the primal energy of creation. I have four limbs and intelligence. They certainly do not have unusual ears, eyes, noses, and mouths. We are all cast from the same mold of creation. That being the case, even if I cannot discern the auditory features of a poem by singing it out, nevertheless, the poems that I make should accord with the poems that they sing, even though we are separated by thousands of miles. This is the marvelous efficacy of what I earlier referred to as the archer's circumspection before he shoots his arrow. So other contributors to this exchange, they also highlighted the kind of natural comparisons to principles in nature. This respondent, Hatakishu, talks about the pipes of nature, the pipes of heaven in Nukina Kaioku's response, and so on. So Umetsuji Shunsho's metaphor of the archer, unsure if he hits his target, incensed Rai Sanyo, who saw Shunsho's response to Ono before the text was published and sent Ono a third letter. And he writes here, even if there are no errors in tonal prosody and one recites out loud in the matter of the interpreters using contemporary Chinese pronunciation, the ears that hear it are still Japanese. It is also a case of the ocean shore-dwelling Yuanju bird fleeing the wind is wholly uninterested in bells and drums of the inland Lu capital. So how could it stir one's feelings? It seems that the archery metaphor has not taken due consideration of this. So Sanyo is rejecting here what he imagines is implied about Japanese poets' aesthetic or ability to render reasonable aesthetic judgments. On the fine points, they clearly diverge, but as we can see here, there is also an emerging consensus that highlights language change over time and expresses dubiousness about the need to acquire contemporary spoken Chinese pronunciation in order to approach Sinitic poetry. Yet as Sanyo's argument here validating Japanese evaluation of Sinitic poetry shows, this argument was in no way incompatible with his recognition of the basic linguistic distinction of Sinitic from Japanese. There's also a commonness to the methods Shiwa authors recommended to their students. Nakai Chikuzan had exemplified a positivist approach and had employed inductive reasoning to draw conclusions about prosody, but his insistence upon the encounter with primary texts was widely shared. As I hope has come through, there is a certain ambivalence in these writings. On the one hand, there is a clear perception that there is an issue to address. These writers were all aware that a poem's aural features are significant components of its effects, even as they also recognize that these effects remain at least somewhat distant to their ears. To varying degrees, the writers express curiosity about how other sinospheric individuals, especially Chinese readers, might regard Japanese Sinitic works. Yet there is also an evident resistance to positing Qing readers as the ultimate authorities who ought to be engaged to render judgment on questions of euphony. The writer's martial arguments that posit tonal prosody and other compositional rules less as the arbitrary inventions of individual Chinese figures, and instead as the manifestation of universal principles grounded in a natural world that aspiring Japanese poets shared. Highlighting the endurance of certain patterns through the changes of time made it possible to define a specific body of knowledge that anyone could master. This assertion created a parallel between present-day Japanese and their counterparts elsewhere in the sinographic world, all of whom were equally removed from Chinese antiquity and also lent support for the validity of Japanese judgments. While these arguments legitimated Japanese Sinitic poets' practice, the ambivalence on this question of oral features would continue. I'd like to close with a brief reflection by one of modern Japan's great novelists, Natsume Soseki, who addressed the issue in the early 20th century. He wrote, "Why has someone like me, a person who can't really distinguish level and deflected tones and has no more than a vague memory of rhyme groups, gone to the trouble of making ingenious contrivances that only have their effect on a Chinese person? In truth, I don't know the answer. But leaving level and deflected tones and rhyme characters aside, the charm of Sinitic poetry has long been Japanized through learning from the Heian period down to the present. It cannot easily be wrested from the minds of Japanese people of my age." I'd like to close there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this deep plunge into reflections on Japanese identity in relation to historical linguistics in China. This was really interesting, and I have opening now for questions. I'm going to ask the first question because I did some research on this while you were speaking, and you said that there were two interlocutors. One is Nakai Chikusan, who says that Qing visitors do not know the entering tone anymore. I guess that's also what you're going to ask, David. And I looked up the Heizhi, and in Cantonese is Hok Yat Tsek. So the entering tone did exist in Southern Mandarin, in Wu dialects, in Cantonese. And in Cantonese, of course, we have the final M. And Chinese, so the first question is, like, is this a reflective of the people that they met, maybe from the Shanghai Delta, or that's number one. And the second question is, were they not aware of Chinese historical linguistics? We had people like Gu Yanwu, Duan Yucai, who observed that in certain dialects, many of the rhyme rules, not all, but the majority of them still prevail.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, I think there definitely is an awareness of historical linguistics and the phenomenon of linguistic change over time. I think that is one of the reasons that the people who are writing these Shiwa, one of the reasons that they feel justified in or feel sort of on a level playing field because everyone is equally removed from the ancient sources of these rules. As for the question of the spatial differences, I think that yes, certain features remain in Southern dialects to this day. And as I mentioned, the entering tone is still discernible in the Sino-Japanese pronunciations of the characters, just as it is in Cantonese. But yes, the encounters that people had were not mainly with people that spoke those Southern dialects that still preserve that feature. So that's a common thing to note, is the absence of the entering tone from the speech of the Qing who are present in Japan.
Question is David Rolston.
two questions about resources. So the Chinese kept a large variety of resources to help them write poetry. And so one besides the Shihua or Xihua, what other kind of stuff did they have to help them? Another resource for us, understanding, for instance, how, like Northern Chinese had trouble writing with Tang pronunciation and so forth, is in fiction. And so there's a very famous novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, in which a good poet teaches a neophyte what you have to do. So for instance, with the questions of the rules, she emphasizes very clearly for the tonal parallelism, you have to do it on certain places before the caesura in the line, but otherwise not. And her pupil begins by saying, there are all these rules, but these famous poets are not following them. So what's the deal? And so the senior poet tells her what you have to stress above all things is originality of thought and things like that. But anyway, do you have any fictional representations of folks trying to write kanshi?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Because you get a kind of a backdoors look at what people thought were problems and how it was done. And matching rhymes is also very important too in Chinese poetry.
Oh, thank you for those questions. They a lot of things to think about. In terms of resources, I think there were, especially later on, certainly rhyme. Well, I was going to say lexicons and instances that were sorted by rhyme groups and rhyme books. So if you were composing, they would be arranged in terms of rhyme, and you could easily. Right. Yeah. Oh, okay. So actually, that point of the changes to rhyme codification, that's something that people will point to as evidence of change over time. The fact that there's a kind of a radical simplification that happens, I think, in the Yuan so
in the Yuan, they sort out the iterating tones into the other classes, for instance.
Yeah. So the fact that disagrees with earlier texts is pointed to as evidence of evidence from contemporary China is not going to be very helpful to us in understanding these Tang texts. As for the issue of fiction, that's an interesting thing to look into. In fiction, nothing occurs, no specific work occurs to me where there's a reference to Sinitic poetry. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one, but I do. There are numerous anecdotes and collections of anecdotes about people composing and being inspired by dreams, for example, and getting the poet, a poem suggested to them in dreams. So collections of anecdotes, the Goldan Show and others have a lot of instances like this, or where there's a kind of, an interpretation of a poem that parallels that of or a line that mirrors that of a famous Chinese poet. So like Bai Zhui or someone like that. Those kinds of anecdotes are sometimes told as well, but I'll have to think more about the fiction.
There's a whole genre in China of scholar novels where the author is showing off their literary cred and to other people, but still, it's a big topic.
Yeah.
Next question is my colleague, Professor Hitomi Tonomura.
Okay. Well, thank you for this amazing study of yours. I wanted to ask two questions. First one, as a amazing scholar who works on these very difficult things in the 20th and 21st century. Should I say, one of the greatest scholars of this time, you. How would you like to describe this situation if you are quoted by people 50 years from now? That's one question. Okay, so the second question is easier, I think. The second question is, Korean language, the grammar is sort of similar to the Japanese, and so I wanted to know how they did this. Yeah. So.
Okay. Thank you for your very kind comments. I think there are the most. This topic is very interesting to me because of it shows how early modern poets in Japan were thinking of themselves, as part of a larger, imagining themselves as part of a larger discourse, and I think that their kind of interest in contributing to that, I think, is a really important aspect of understanding these works. That it's primarily in terms of its actual audience, it's domestically focused, but there's also, as I was trying to suggest, there's a kind of an imagined reader or a potential reader outside or beyond the immediate Japanese context that is also something that they are aware of. And so that kind of dual-facing aspect, that kind of the multiplicity, it has a local practices in terms of how Sinitic texts are read locally, but also is part of a larger conversation. I like that that dual aspect is something that I think is really important to attend to, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to emphasize one extreme or the other of that, to either only look at the universal aspects and not look at the local specificity of Sinitic texts, or to only look at the specific, the local, and say there was no concern for thinking about this, the Sinitic texts in a larger context, and to see it as a entirely, all happening within the Japanese language, for example. So I kind of want to sort of maintain or preserve the dual facing quality to it, if that makes sense. I don't know. Yes. And your second question? Okay. I would like to know more about this myself. I think I'm not a Koreanist at all, and so I can't speak authoritatively on this. But my understanding is that there were processes that were similar to kundoku in the Korean setting. And many people think that's the source of kundoku practices in the Japanese archipelago. But that one difference that tends to be the case is that Korean scholars kind of had more of a higher, larger chunks that they worked with. So blocks of Chinese characters would be sort of grouped together in a way that's not as discretely partitioned as Japanese Sinitic or sinological scholars did. So that's one difference between them. Yeah.
In the reason why I asked was in your Nihon Shiwa Social, 10 volumes, there was one Korean name, which
Right.
was signed in Korean
Yeah.
alphabet, right? So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, so that text is Tongying Xihua, which was included in that collection because of the time it was published. What I mean by that is the collection was published in the 19-teens. And at that time, of course, it was during the colonial period. And so it was included for that reason. But that text is quite interesting because it was read by Japanese scholars in the early modern period, in the Edo period. It was reprinted in Japan with Japanese reading marks. And so they read it, and some of them used, in that text, there's a lot of reference to a lot of the famous, mainly it's profiles of famous Korean Sinitic poets, and it's interesting to look at what makes them great and why they are praised and so forth. But some of the features, some of the particular poems that are quoted there are sometimes used by Japanese Sinitic poets as the basis of claims that they make. So they may say, like, look here in this Korean Shihua, there's this poem. It's cited. So and there are also there's an interesting thinking about the difference between the Korean language and the Chinese language is also something that's referenced in that text, and is something that Japanese people would have read as well. So,
Okay, the next question is Sabo.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating for people who know about the poetry, and it's exponentially fascinating for somebody who doesn't know anything about it. And
glad to hear.
so much vaster. My question is, did calligraphy also contributed or followed this interpretation of the Chinese poetry? That's one question. My other question is, you mentioned a vernacular poetry that influenced this. Not knowing much about it, is haiku part of that vernacular poetry, or other parts, or other vernacular?
Thank you very much for those questions. On your first question about calligraphy and the importance of calligraphy, definitely that Sinitic, both prose and poetry, were very often the object or the content of calligraphic texts, and I talked about. I showed many examples of printed texts where you see the kunten markings that would tell you how to rearrange the text so that you might construe it as Japanese. That's something that you would not see in calligraphy. So the calligraphic work would just be the Sinitic text as is. But that was also very much part of this milieu, for sure. As for vernacular poetry, yes, there are occasional references in the works of writers of Shiwa that reference both Japan's waka poetry tradition and haiku. And this is something that it doesn't tend to be so common. Most of the authorities and most of the arguments that are made in the context of Japanese Shiwa tend to be appeals to earlier, mainly Chinese, authorities, right? They say like so-and-so says this in this text, and you know, this principle is you know, manifest there and so forth. But you do see some appeals to analogies that can be drawn with the vernacular, Japanese vernacular tradition. And so I gave one example where in Bayan's case, he talks about puns and wordplay, and he says it's just like in the Manyoshu, how, you know, iwate sounds like iwade, and minu has a double meaning, and so on. And so that's often an analogy that's used for maybe a broader audience, maybe beginners or people who are learning, or people who are not like sinological scholars, but sort of trying to open up the conversation a little bit more and maybe broaden the audience a little bit more. So there's actually one scholar who wrote two Shiwa, Tsusaka Toyo is his name, and he wrote one of them in literary Sinitic, and he wrote the other one in Wabun, in Japanese. And the Wabun one has a lot of discussion of kind of analogies that one might draw to the vernacular tradition. You asked the example of haiku specifically, and the example that comes to mind is actually by a Shiwa author, Hirose Tanso, from, he was active in the end of the early modern period, and his Shiwa was published in early Meiji. And he mentions a haiku teacher who gave the example, you know, his student had come up with a haiku, and it basically had too many things going on in it. There were too many images. And so he said, no, try again, you know, simplify it. And so he took out one of the images, and it's better, but try again. And then he took out all but one image, and he said, okay, that's good. And so that metaphor is then used to explain, you know, you shouldn't have too many images in your Sinitic poems also. So there are sometimes analogies that are drawn to explain that way.
The next question is from Professor Kevin Carr from Art History.
Actually, I did want to ask more about calligraphy, but we can discuss that more later. But I am interested maybe in a different time when people were writing Chinese-style poems and they had Chinese speakers around. I'm thinking, say, medieval Zen, the sort of goes-on era. I'm just curious about, you know, I know that's a very different context and this is not the sort of focus of that, but do you have a sense of, did any of the theory or the directions that came from that era get carried into the early modern period? Were they thinking of what, say, goes-on monks were doing in any of the same sort of concepts of what, say, these poets were doing?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that that yes, of course, there is influence in terms of you know, a lot of the texts that were studied by the Gozan monks. They are certainly foundational to, especially in the early part of the early modern period. And so there's continuity in that sense. One thing that's often said about, if you look at the whole kind of scope of Sinitic literature in Japan, is that the custodians of that body of literature change over time. So it's the courtiers, and then it's the Gozan monks, and then it moves to Confucian scholars. And so when it moves to Confucian scholars in the early modern period, there's a bit of a kind of border policing maybe between the earlier Gozan tradition and the Confucian tradition. And so sometimes you'll see, as the scholar Ivo Smits has written about the fact that Gozan is often missing or slighted by the treatment in early modern histories of the Sinitic literary tradition, and sometimes that's, histories might dismiss that kind of. They sometimes use the term vegetarian fare as those too monkish or something. Those kinds of poems that were not sometimes like kind of reeking of incense or something like that. Those associations are sometimes made. However, I ended with Soseki. Soseki was a huge fan of Gozan Sinitic poetry, and so this sort of specific Gozan poets kind of come back. He was particularly taken with Shokenko, that text. But yeah.
So there's a question in the back. Could you introduce yourself? Just.
Oh yeah, hi. I'm Mike. I'm a second year current Japanese student. As like a Chinese student myself, I personally have written many Chinese synthetic poems, and I do think I learned a little bit about the rules as well. So I'm kind of curious, since that as for modern day knowledge, the way of how people sing the ancient Chinese synthetic poems no longer known.
Yeah.
Like people no longer knows how to actually sing them. So how is it actually being studied in Japan literature? And moreover, since I think Japanese people still sing waka, which is like I think it's like a variation of their Japanese poetry. And is there any relationship between waka and the Chinese ci, which is like a later variation of Chinese synthetic poem?
Yeah. So thank you for those questions. I'd be curious what kind of rhyme dictionaries and so forth you use in your composition.
Yeah. I'm actually also very curious about that, because I think Professor there did mention the resources that Chinese people use, so such as like rhyme books and like parallel books. There's like a few parallel books I did like refer to. People call it like the Shenlü Qimeng, like the start of like a beginning guide of sounding rules, basically, where you learn how to make like parallel and rhyme sounds.
Yeah.
And also mentioned in the like the fictions, such as like the Dream of the Red Chamber. There's like a scene where like people has like a chamber, like a wall of boxes, where like each box represents a rhyme like a rhyme feet,
right.
and they make like they pull out cards and then start making like poems just based on their rhyme feet. There's like show off stuff in China. So I do wonder if that's also introduced in like ancient Japanese poetry.
Definitely. So the sorts of games that you're mentioning, where you might draw something and have to compose a poem on that, that's very common in Japan as well. Or maybe dividing a line of poetry, and each person takes one of the characters, and that's the rhyme. And those kinds of practices are common from Heian onward. Your first question, you asked about sort of recitation practices. I think, and the fact that the kind of original music is lost, and that's that awareness of the fact that no one really knows how to sing and sort of what the original music was, that awareness is certainly conveyed to Japan, and is the reason that some of the people whom I mentioned sort of they have questions about the relevance of these rules. In terms of recitational practice for Sinitic poems, it seems that there were different forms that were popular with different schools and different academies and different scholars in the early modern period may have had different approaches to this. There is a practice now called shigin, that's chanting of Sinitic poems. Not just Sinitic poems, they also chant waka and other things. Both Chinese poets and Japanese poets works are the material for shigin. But this is one thing that I was struck by in reading through these texts is the lack of specific description of recitational practice or the lack of comments about what style of kundoku is desirable or what this is better than this style or something. None that I can think of in almost all of the whole source there. So it's surprising how little that rises to the fore.
Okay, so this is prime real estate in Weiser Hall, and I've been asked firmly by the staff of the CGS to wrap up the session. So can we give him a heartfelt applause for this fantastic presentation?